It started quietly. That's the part no one wants to talk about. No sirens. No cameras. No dramatic confrontation at the gates. Just a late-night sweep of a house that was supposed to be untouchable. A place the public has been told, over and over again, is private, protected, removed from the machinery of royal consequence. But before we continue, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And yet, within hours of that sweep ending, something changed. Royal privileges. Gone. Not debated. Not delayed. Stripped. Here's the unsettling part. This wasn't the result of a long investigation finally reaching its conclusion. It wasn't the outcome of years of tension boiling over. According to multiple accounts tied to the process itself, this decision moved faster than anyone expected. Faster than stories usually do. Which raises a question that's hard to ignore. What do you have to find for the system to move that fast? For years, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have spoken about distance, about separation, about stepping away from royal protection while still retaining certain courtesies, certain understandings that were never written down but always honored. Privileges that existed in a gray area. Conditional, perhaps, but assumed. Until last night. The sweep wasn't announced. It wasn't meant to be. It took place well after dark at the Montecito property. The official reason, on paper, was routine. Procedural. The kind of justification that usually leads nowhere. And most of the time, it doesn't. This time it did. Something was discovered. Not explosive in the cinematic sense. No flashing headlines. No immediate leaks. In fact, the word being used by those familiar with the discovery isn't illegal. It's embarrassing. And that word should make you pause. Because embarrassment, at this level, isn't about shame. It's about exposure. About contradiction. About material that doesn't match the story that's been told publicly, or worse, material that confirms what wasn't supposed to be provable. Ask yourself this. What kind of discovery doesn't trigger public scandal, but does trigger private consequences? That's where this story lives. Within hours of the investigator finishing their sweep, calls were made. Not many. Not loudly. But decisively. And by the time morning came, the status quo was gone. The protections that had lingered, unofficial but real, were no longer assumed. This wasn't framed as punishment. That's important. It was framed as reassessment. A recalculation, which suggests something else entirely. That whatever was found didn't just raise eyebrows. It crossed a threshold. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about what this story is not. This is not about relitigating old grievances. It's not about replaying interviews or tabloid accusations. This is about a moment. A narrow window in time when a private discovery triggered an immediate institutional response. Those moments are rare. And when they happen, they usually mean someone saw something they weren't supposed to see. So the question isn't whether this discovery mattered. That part is already answered. The real question is what, exactly, turned a late-night sweep into a line that could not be uncrossed. Because the sweep itself wasn't the story. What happened during it is. And once you understand why that investigator stopped treating the visit as routine and started treating it as urgent, the rest begins to fall into place. But not in the way you'd expect. You ever wonder why some operations happen only after dark? Not because they're illegal, not even because they're secret, but because the daylight asks too many questions. That's what makes this particular night so strange and so telling. The Montecito property, usually still by 10 p.m., saw unfamiliar movement well past midnight. A sleek, unmarked SUV, not unusual in California, rolled through the gates without headlights. No police escort. No flashing lights. No royal security detail in plain sight. Just a soft hush of tires on gravel and a subtle shuffle of feet. It didn't feel urgent. It felt precise. The team, according to one source close to the situation, had clearance. Legal. Clean. But tightly compartmentalized. Only a few individuals were aware of the sweep before it began, and even fewer were briefed on why it needed to happen that night, and not a moment later. That's not how things usually work with royal adjacents. There's formality, protocol, layers of communication, even for routine requests. But this time, no red tape, no announcements. It was as if someone wanted to get in and get out before the house remembered it wasn't supposed to let them in. And that's the part that still doesn't sit right. Why now? What triggered a procedural inspection, of a property that has, for the better part of 3 years, been treated as hands-off territory by both the British institution and U.S. counterparts. One insider, who agreed to speak off-record, hinted at an unusual change in the classification of certain assets tied to the Sussex household. Nothing illegal, just reclassified. Which often happens when a private residence begins behaving more like a public entity, or when it's connected to something bigger. It's not just a house anymore. It's a hub. For meetings. For content production. For guests. For movement. And with that comes visibility. And with visibility, accountability. So the sweep wasn't invasive. Not officially. But it wasn't ordinary either. Devices were scanned. Documents reviewed. Certain rooms, the office, the guest suite, a detached storage area, were given more attention than others. One person familiar with these operations described it as calm, almost courteous. Until it wasn't. Because halfway through the process, without drama, without alarm, something shifted. Quietly, but clearly. A member of the team, not the lead, not even the most senior, paused. Then motioned for a second set of gloves. Not a big gesture. Easy to miss. But meaningful. That's the moment where, according to someone briefed after the fact, routine stopped being the word we were using. The item itself hasn't been named. Not officially. But it wasn't a single object, we're told. More like a collection. A folder. Digital or physical. That's still unclear. But what is clear is that it contained material that required escalation. Not just documentation, but rerouting. And here's where it gets interesting. There was no call for immediate removal. No evidence of criminality. But the tone in the room, according to someone who was outside but close enough to see faces on the way out, had changed completely. From polite efficiency to a kind of brittle alertness. One team member reportedly made a call before even getting back in the vehicle. Not to law enforcement. Not to media. But to London. And what followed wasn't panic. It was precision. Reactions started behind the scenes. A briefing was sent. Certain advisors were looped in. And somewhere between midnight and sunrise, the tone shifted once again, from reaction to decision. The privileges, the courtesies, the boundaries, the gestures of goodwill that had quietly remained intact even after the public split, were now being reevaluated. No announcement. No headlines. Just disappearance. The kind of disappearance that doesn't draw attention, until everything around it starts to unravel. And this all raises a much larger, more difficult question. If this sweep, quiet, calculated, and contained, triggered that level of consequence, what was the discovery that made routine disappear? That answer started revealing itself not in what was found, but in how fast the damage control began. And it began before the team even left the driveway. What do you do when you realize you've crossed a line, without knowing exactly where that line was? Because that's what this felt like, not a discovery in the dramatic sense, but a quiet unraveling. A slow, creeping realization that something had gone too far. Or maybe, had been going too far for a while. The reaction didn't begin with publicists. It didn't start with lawyers. It started with silence. The kind of silence that fills a room right after a revelation. Not the loud, crashing kind, but the stillness that follows a shift. You know something's different. You just can't say it out loud yet. That was the mood, according to someone who's been in the room for similar scenarios. Calm. Cold. Deliberate. One of the investigators placed their phone face down. Another began rewriting their field notes. Not redacting. Reframing. That tells you everything. See, when something genuinely dangerous is found, the response is protocol. Chain of command. Documentation. But when something reputational is found, not illegal, but radioactive, the response is strategic. The fewer people who see it, the better. And the more quickly you can contain the damage, the less likely it spirals. Which brings us to the call. It wasn't urgent. It was specific. London was notified, but not through the usual channels. Not the palace switchboard. Not the Privy Council. A private number. Old school. Trusted. The person on the other end didn't ask what was found. They asked what the implications were. That's the part that keeps surfacing. Implications. Not evidence. Not scandal. Implications. We're told the materials weren't linked to a single event or moment, but instead created a kind of pattern. A trail. Something that could be read as misleading. Or worse, misaligned. Which brings us into dangerous territory. Because when you operate in the blurred space between royalty and celebrity, your privileges are unwritten. They're not protected by law. They're upheld by understanding, by mutual respect, by discretion, by tradition. But traditions break quietly. One of the advisors looped in during the early morning hours reportedly asked a chilling question. If this had been found by someone else, say, in the press, what would the reaction have been? No one had an answer. And that silence became the answer. That's when the tone shifted again. The language turned colder. Phrases like exemption reassessment, cross-border discretion, and optics risk entered the room. Let's pause on that for a second. Optics risk. That's not language for criminal exposure. That's not crisis PR. That's institutional speak. That's the crown running its calculations. What is the cost of continuing to grant privileges that no longer align with behavior? What's the cost of quietly pulling them back? And most importantly, which cost is easier to control? That's what damage control looks like at this level. It's not about punishment. It's about risk containment. From what we understand, one of the items found had direct links to a recent engagement, possibly charitable or commercial, and it contradicted statements made in public forums, interviews, published essays, perhaps even contracts. Again, not explosive on its own, but damaging because of how it frames the pattern, because of what it implies about intent. And that, more than anything else, is what the palace cares about, intent. Missteps can be forgiven. Embarrassments can be outlived. But if it begins to look like there's an intentional pattern of misrepresentation, that's when you move, quietly and fast. So by the time breakfast was being served in Montecito, back in London, the language was already being finalized. Not revocation, not penalty, but clarification. Certain protections, honors, and accesses, once left intact out of goodwill, were now under review. In some cases, already suspended. And the Sussexes? They weren't briefed through an official statement. It came via a private note. A few lines. Formal, but unmistakable. The implication was clear. Things had changed. But what hadn't changed, not yet, was the question that haunted everyone in the background of this entire process. What happens if the full contents of that discovery go public? Because someone always talks. And the most unsettling thing about a quiet sweep is that silence has a shelf life. Royal privilege doesn't vanish in a press release. It dissolves in private, behind closed doors, through the kind of language that doesn't need to be repeated twice. No warning, no fireworks, just subtle disappearance. That's what makes this so disturbing. There was no formal declaration, no public disgrace. But the shift? It was unmistakable. The message wasn't "you've been punished." It was "you no longer qualify." Let's think about that for a moment. Because this wasn't just about what was found. It was about how what was found reframed everything that came before it. Years of strained diplomacy, careful avoidance, tentative allowances suddenly looked naive. Or worse, exploited. And here's the thing. Most of what Meghan and Harry retained post-Megxit wasn't official. Titles, yes. But the softer things? Access, invitations, protections, courtesy calls, institutional silence. Those weren't obligations. They were courtesies. Unspoken agreements that relied on mutual respect and the assumption that public statements aligned, at least loosely, with private behavior. But when that assumption erodes, privilege becomes conditional, not out of revenge, out of necessity. And that's what happened here. The item, or rather, the compilation, found during the late-night sweep, cast a long shadow. It didn't scream scandal. It whispered manipulation. A project, perhaps, presented one way publicly, but backed by materials suggesting something more transactional, something that leaned less on truth and more on strategy. We still don't know the exact content, but insiders have hinted that it painted a picture of image management so controlled, so curated, that it appeared incompatible with the narrative of vulnerability that had defined much of the Sussex post-royal brand. Let that sink in. Because if the gap between personal truth and public message grows wide enough, the institution starts to notice. Not because it cares about personal reputation, but because it risks being dragged into the fallout. And that risk? That's the line. So when the word came down, again, not official, not public, it was decisive. Certain